welcome to the pilot episode that is yet untitled of a podcast that I may start, depending on A, what I feel like, and B, if anybody even cares. Um, I've kind of kicked around the idea of doing a podcast for a while, especially since I started listening to some at my day job to drown out the awful pop music that plays 24/7. So, uh, here is my show. Okay. I think it's important to upfront let you know that this show is a lot of stuff that is my opinion on it. So if you don't agree with it, that's fine. I'm I invite you to have your own opinion. It's funny because a lot of people will give me trouble for having an opinion that doesn't fit in with the usually like the hardcore thing of all the hardcore people like this cult game or this cult game or don't like this. And at the same time, I don't really fall into the kind of more mainstreamy thing to some degree. So it tends to be that I have a lot of people that are annoyed at me for not liking or liking certain things, no matter what my opinions are. So I am putting it up front to let you know that this whole thing is very much a lot of my own personal opinions, and it is totally fine for you to disagree with me. All right. So first, I was going to cover just a few articles of news that I read in the last few days and what I think of them and why I'm sharing them. So the first one comes from PlayStation's Middle East Twitter account, which is kind of hinting at Crash Bandicoot, which, if you remember, the PSX show started with Sean Layden, who is the Sony's the first party productions president. I'm not quite sure what his job title is now with all of them moving around, but he came on a stage with a Crash Bandicoot shirt, which he didn't talk at all about Crash Bandicoot, but it kind of was, everyone was assuming it would be in line with Final Fantasy VII's announcement at last year's PSX, which turned out to be an announcement for just a port of the PC version, which is in turn a port of the PS1 version, which is not quite what people expected, to be followed up with the announcement of the remake at E3 2015. So, if they're pulling that same thing of having look, Crash Bandicoot, oh wait, we're not going to talk about it. It's a similar thing, a little different, but that same kind of teasing, And, it's worth noting, obviously, a lot of people have this misconception that Sony owned Crash Bandicoot at one point and sold it to Activision, when that is not at all the case. Originally, it was published by Universal Games, who had a distribution deal with Sony, so Sony was paying for the distribution of the game, but did not own the property. And the game contract lasted 3 games. The same thing was true with Spyro the Dragon. So after those 3 games of each franchise, I believe Eurocom developed Crash Bash also on the PS1, but beyond that, both Spyro and Crash Bandicoot went multi-platform, but were handled by different teams of every game past that. So following that, Universal Games eventually got folded into Vivendi, which was purchased by Activision. So Activision has owned the rights. They used Spyro as a way to make Skylanders seem less risky initially when it came out. So Spyro is probably forever going to be trapped under the Skylanders banner. We'll probably never see another original Spyro-themed game. So that's kind of a shame. So where's Crash Bandicoot? Well, he's been missing a while. Obviously, you haven't seen anything about Crash Bandicoot besides maybe, the classics on the PlayStation Network or something like that. He's kind of been missing in action since the early or late PS2, early 360, PS3 era. So you got that. But, with all of these things, you've got, Sean Layden with the shirt, and you've got PlayStation Twitter teasing that. There's also been inside rumors I've seen on NeoGAF and other places about nothing direct, but kind of like, keep your ears open. Things happen for a reason. That sort of like small teases about regards to Crash Bandicoot. So that's interesting. What would a Crash Bandicoot look like, if it were made today? Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin were the people that made it back in the 90s. I remember, June 2013, there's an article, I have it up here. Andy Gavin suggested that the way to revitalize the series, quote unquote, Crash needs a total reboot. There's an opportunity to reset the history and go back to his creation story and the original conflict with Cortex. In that context, you could reprise the classic Crash 1 and Crash 2 settings and villains. It would make sense to use a more modern free roaming style and I would concentrate on Looney Tunes-esque animation with really addictive action. That's what we did with the original Crash, and there's no reason it couldn't be done today. Given the current Crash games, people forget that he was once cool. Our Crash had a certain whimsical edge to him. Sure, it was goofy, but it wasn't dumb. And that's an interesting thing is with that news, or with that information, and with the hints that there might be a new Crash thing. What would people even want to see in a reboot? Because it always, reboots in general always have this thing of, we got to modernize it for the people of today, and at the same time, usually a reboot is happening because it's kind of cashing in on nostalgia. So the farther you get away from what makes the people nostalgic, the less of a reason that you're even doing a reboot in the first place. So it's always got that kind of weird thing. And Crash Bandicoot is a very interesting thing to look back on. Like, it very much was kind of an evolution of the 2D platformer, but kind of over the shoulder look, a camera angle, if it were. And the 3D platformers didn't quite evolve that way, so it kind of is left in this very specific style of gameplay. And beyond the Crash trilogy, can't think of many, if any, games besides stuff like Temple Run, which is very roughly a 3D platformer, that have that behind the shoulder locked camera angle while there's 3D platforming. So were it to be something along those lines, I'm not sure if people would be happy. There's stuff nowadays, you could look at the latest Mario, you can look at stuff like Psychonauts and Beyond Good and Evil that kind of push the genre in different directions, as well as stuff like, even Jak and Daxter, the first one. It really kind of expanded on the base gameplay without using that kind of a camera angle. And again, you have Crash Bandicoot 1, which pretty much feels like a reboot of Crash Bandicoot in and of itself. And, if you took it in that direction, it would be almost easier just to almost have a spin-off of of Jak and Daxter or something along those lines, as I think most people that like Crash Bandicoot would probably be fine with that. As I said, it's very similar to the Crash Bandicoot games. And if you're going to go with kind of an evolved thing that's already plays like Jak and Daxter, you might as well go all the way. And again, that leaves us in that position of what would a modern Crash Bandicoot look like? Would we reboot it, as they said, and would they reboot it, as they said, and make it a free-roaming game? And if so, would that really feel like Crash Bandicoot? Would that really be what you wanted? I mean, I don't feel like there's any right answer, per se. I think it's a very interesting question to think about. As a sucker for 3D platformers myself, you basically could tell me it's a 3D platform and I'd already be interested. I picked up all the Sly Cooper games, all the Jak and Daxter, Ratchet and Clanks, Beyond Good and Evil, Psychonauts. You gave me a 3D platformer, I am there as soon as it's announced. So whatever that does end up being, I'll probably end up buying it. And the other thing that we have to kind of keep our expectations in check is due to, it seems dumb, but sometimes companies do this. It could be, just hyping up all of this, end up being like PS1 games, in 1080p on the PlayStation Network or something, starting with the Crash Bandicoot trilogy. And I think that a lot of people would get angry, and, I think I would have to think that Sony knows that. Knowing them, I would say they probably won't do that, but who knows, So it's worth keeping your expectations in check, that it's not something new until we see something, at the E3 press conference or something like that. We don't really know for sure. And, it's an interesting thing to think about, and I will continue to watch this story because it's fascinating. It's also very interesting to see how people remember Crash. So, okay. That was one of the news things I noticed. Another one I'm seeing is Firewatch has frame rate issues and minor crashes and stuff on the PS4. And I say minor crashes because while I've heard there's a crash or two, it doesn't seem like as widespread as the frame rate issues. And that's a real shame because I was really looking forward to Firewatch, and now I'm sitting there with it in my cart and I'm like, should I buy it? Should I buy it? And I keep hearing from people that have it that it's a fantastic game, but part of me is a little worried because slow-paced first-person games, especially exploration ones, tend to give me motion sickness, which is really strange because I don't get motion sickness very easily. And when I think about listing all the games that gave me motion sickness, it's mostly really fast-paced games or games that have a high amount of blur or a high frame rate. For example, any old first-person shooter like Doom or Duke Nukem Marathon, all of them run at such a frame rate that it's hard for me to play it without feeling nauseous rather quickly. In terms of more recent games, Rage on the PS3, when I tried playing that, I really liked the game, but it just made me feel really sick to my stomach. And even more recently, I bought Vanishing of Ethan Carter, which I thought seemed really cool, but again, I could not play more than maybe half an hour before I felt really ill. I have not been able to go back. The same is true for Everyone's Gone to the Rapture, which I was so interested in the story, but I just could not keep playing it because I started feeling really sick. So I'm hoping Firewatch doesn't fall in that same category. And frame rate issues sounds like it could be something depending on how it's done that would make me feel that way. I mean, the same boat with the Witness, which I've been excited for a long time, and I heard that it gave people motion sickness issues who already had them playing that game. So, I'm really excited to eventually play that game. Don't get me wrong, but I'm kind of on the fence. I it's hard to like find a video of it to kind of get an idea if it would give me motion sickness because it's very spoiler ridden, no matter what you're watching. So I've got this kind of maybe I should wait till it goes on sale, or maybe I should wait for the patch to drop and see if there's any new people talking about it and see if it kind of works out. Whatever the case, I've heard that it's absolutely worth the price and it's a fantastic game. And it has been confirmed that there is a patch in the works by Campo Santo, the developers. So we do have to wait for however long it takes to go through, certification to make sure the patch is available on the PlayStation Network. I think that the PC version has been patched, but I can't confirm that as I don't have it for PC. So there's that. The last bit of news I'm going to talk about briefly is in Japan, the remaster of Valkyria Chronicles for the PS4 came out, and it came with a demo of the spin-off to the series, Valkyria Azure Revolution, and a demo of it. So, I've kind of been looking forward to it because, for me, I loved Valkyria Chronicles 1. I thought it was a fantastic game. One of my favorite Japanese games of the last generation of consoles. It was a very interesting take on both strategy RPGs, the Japanese RPG kind of genre in and of itself, as well as just an interesting kind of alternate history World War II game, because it's very obviously based on World War II, but none of the countries or anything are this world. They're all kind of their own their own names, their own kind of history and stuff like that. So it's kind of very much in the same way that Killzone is very like futuristic Nazi kind of thing. This is kind of a World War II kind of a thing, and I thought it was a very pretty game and a very colorful game that tackles some kind of difficult stuff in a way that doesn't kind of bum you out completely, while it still makes you think about it, and overall was just a lot of fun to play. And I was kind of let down with the second one. There were some cool gameplay enhancements, but a lot of stuff was dialed back due to it being a PSP game, and it felt like obviously they had to make concessions for the hardware, is that the areas were smaller, and instead there was a bunch of small areas instead of one large area, which kind of does some interesting stuff gameplay-wise, but it overall felt kind of a step back in some degree. It also kind of, I'm guessing due to the initial low sales of the first game, which ended up going on to sell over 1 million copies on the PS3, the PSP one, which was made for the PSP because in Japan the PSP was, it was a big deal for many years, a lot bigger of a deal than the PS3 was in Japan. So a lot of games came out on the PSP, and it continued to sell until, only a few years ago when it finally started slowing down because 3DS and the Vita kind of took its sales position. So a lot of Japanese games were landing on one of the two handhelds, and Valkyria Chronicles 2, to make it, I guess, a more of a sure bet, was launched on the PSP, which is strangely enough, or not strangely enough, but like it's interesting because it didn't make as big of a splash in America, and likewise the game sold much worse in America, whereas Valkyria Chronicles 1 sold fairly decently in America. So it probably had a much lower budget, obviously because the PSP is not as powerful as the PS3, so the assets and everything don't need to be anywhere near as high quality. But I'm curious to see if it made even as much money as the first one. Suffice to say, the game itself, not only was it pared down as such and on a platform that wasn't really a big deal in the West, But in addition, the game's story was very much clicheized. Instead of having it be a World War II thing, it's kind of a post World War II thing where you play as a bunch of malicious school kids who have all of these, school drama things in between missions, and it feels really kind of weird. It doesn't really feel right, and it takes you very much out of the feeling of the whole setting of it. And the voice acting is also pretty bad, and the writing is not amazing. So while you have not great story overall, not interesting characters, and it's just a bland, mediocre story, but it's still fun to play due to being based on the engine from Valkyria Chronicles 1. And Valkyria Chronicles 3 released on PSP in Japan in, I think, 2011, but was never released in America. And from what I've heard of it, it's in the same vicinity of decency as Valkyria Chronicles 1. It's a lot better. It's more focused. It's not as cliche, and it's just overall a great game. It's such a shame that it didn't come out in America, because I would totally play that. Give me an HD remake of it or anything, and I would be all over that. And I'll continue to, I bought Valkyria Chronicles 1, all the downloadable content. I bought Valkyria Chronicles 2 and all the downloadable content. And I am planning on buying the Valkyria Chronicles HD version on PS4 just to help support them. So it's interesting, with that kind of a context. I was looking forward to seeing what they were doing with a spin-off, because I know the first thing they announced was that it's not a tactics strategy RPG. So okay, I'm fine with that. I just would like to see what's going on. And so they finally, the demo came out, and there's people streaming it and videos online. And my first thing is, it looks really rough. Graphically it looks okay, and the music is really fantastic. So original music props. I heard it might be Yasunori Mitsuda, the guy that did the music for Chrono Trigger or Chrono Cross, and I hope I pronounced his name right. But I do not know. Besides that, though, the sound effects were pretty atrocious right off the bat. Like, the walking sound effect sounds like a PS1 game. The combat seems incredibly clunky. It reminds me of like Japanese shooters from 2002 or something, where they were just kind of getting how to make a shooting game. It seems like you kind of aim your character in towards a direction and hit the fire button. There's no aimer or anything. It's just kind of wonky. And then when you get within a range of enemy characters, the game kind of does this thing and switches to, you're now in close quarters mode, and everybody switches to melee combat. And rather than being kind of a seamless thing as you get close to people, it seems like a clunk, and it really takes you out of it and defeats the flow of the game. So I don't know. I'm not sure what to think. And from what I understand, it's kind of supposed to be in line with the Final Fantasy 15 demo, which is their way of kind of doing early access, where it's not really early access per se, but it's a way that they can sell you something, give you a demo to play so you can give them feedback, and then they can use the feedback from that to make a changes to the final game. So it's it could turn out a lot better. It looks incredibly rough right now, to be honest, and I'm a little worried because of how much I love that series and how much this could turn out to be pretty awful if it stays the course. So I'm willing to give it the benefit of the doubt, and I will continue to keep my eye on it. I'm not shutting it out, but again, it looked really rough. I'll definitely be interested in the soundtrack no matter what, though. So that's it for the news things I'm going to cover right now. It might be more in the future. We'll see. I just kind of picked a few out of what I had open in my tabs in my browser. But let me see. I wanted to have a short talk. I'd been talking to a friend recently, and we were discussing, what made a game good. And I kind of segued off of that while I was thinking about it, after I've been discussing this, and kind of thinking about review scores in general, which I've always been a little hesitant on, because it's very easy to just look up reviews and then scroll down and see what the score is, or go to Metacritic and get kind of an idea of the quality of a game. And I have to admit to being guilty to that some of the time. I generally don't let reviews skew me on if I'm going to buy something unless they're extremely negative. So if there's a game I'm looking forward to and it scores 7s, I'll still go out and buy it, because I trust myself more than I trust game reviewers online, and I'd rather form my own opinion. If it's really low, I can assume that either the game is just terrible or it's got some severe technical issues, and that will probably convince me not to get it right away, or at least look into why it's getting low reviews. But suffice to say, I kind of started thinking about what I was thinking about like some of the top rated games of all time, like why they are where they are, and it made me go into what defines a perfect 10 in a video game rating. And it doesn't have to be any place that gives it scores 1 through 10 or 1 through 5 or A through F like 1UP used to do, but any place that gives scores whatever their perfect score is. And what does that mean in a context of video game? And I came to some points that I thought, which was, I think that a perfect game is either one of two things: it's simple or it's not perfect. And what I mean by that is a lot of old games, stuff that I would consider nearly perfect or perfect games. Like I have a huge soft spot for Legend of Zelda. Excuse me, The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, which I think did 2D puzzle design absolutely perfectly. But if you look at it from the point of view of just what the game is doing, it's a rather simple game. And the less things going on, the less can go wrong, and the less different parts of the game are going to be boring or suck. And so you have this kind of specific amount of content to work on. And I think that as we move forward in video games these days, there's so much more going on in each video game that the odds of one part of the video game being worse is a lot higher. If you compare something like Metal Gear Solid 5 to the original Metal Gear 1 on the MSX or the NES, there's a whole lot going on in comparison. You can make you can make the comparisons. Oh well, you're still sneaking around and getting guards, but just the act of interacting with a guard is hitting a button, to punch them or to shoot at them in the original one, and aiming your character towards them. That is the extent of that. Whereas with Metal Gear Solid 5, you have all sorts of stuff going on for each encounter. You can shoot at them, you can shoot them in the arm so they drop their gun, you can shoot at their radio so they can't shoot it, or you can't call for backup, you can run over people, you can sneak by, you can grab them from behind the back, and it adds a whole lot more to each encounter. And with that, there's so many places where things can go wrong. And it's kind of, with technology, it's the same thing where, stuff like the space shuttle ran on something less powerful than an Xbox, and the reason for it is there's less moving parts and less likely for things to break. And I feel like the same applies for video games in the context of systems within the games rather than the hardware, what I'm talking about here. So I would say the complexities of a game of today, and I'm not just Metal Gear Solid 5, but almost any game that comes out, is probably in the 100,000 times more if you're talking about code, if you're talking about things happening per frame, etc. So with that, it becomes that much harder to get something with no issues at all. And it makes it harder and harder to feel like a perfect score even means anything anymore, because I think that, if released now, it would be hard for somebody to consider Link to the Past a perfect 10. Despite it being so good at everything that it does, it wouldn't have the production values associated with a perfect 10. And even if it was, would it be a 2D game? If it's still a 2D game, it's hard for people to go, oh yeah, that's a perfect 10 to some degree, because it doesn't feel competitive to the things around it in regards to production values. And it's hard. It's often very hard with 2D games to have an art style that feels high budget, as it were. I think that the Rayman games did a good job about that. Rayman Legends and Rayman Origins had a good job of feeling like these feel like meaty $60 games. And it's hard because most 2D games these days are downloadable games, and there's no knock here about downloadable games. Downloadable games are fantastic, but they're generally done on a lower budget, and I think that it shows in the final product. And I have nothing against it. There are beautiful 2D platformers, but they all, to some degree, I feel like scream that we didn't have as much money as somebody making a larger scale 3D game. And even in the context of like Super Nintendo games and stuff, I think to some degree the pushing the tech was a lot higher, and so you were constantly working around what was possible. Where now, when you make a 2D game, you can pretty much do anything, and so without those limitations, you kind of have to limit yourself in what you can financially afford. So, what would a perfect game look like now? Uh, when I think of perfect games, I only have a few games that pop to mind. A few older games that are very simplistic but do things very well. So, um, I would put Super Mario World, Link to the Past, Myth 2, Soulblighter, and man, as we progress farther in time, it becomes hard because there's so many games that I love so much that I think are in the running for greatest game of all time. But at the same time, I can see so many flaws with them, despite that fact. And yet, I will go back and play them even more than some of these games that I would give a 10 out of 10. So it hits that thing where I feel like the games are better, but at the same time, they definitely have flaws. Like I say, this should be better, this could be better. And so what makes is that competitive as a perfect 10 game, quote unquote. That's the thing that makes me feel like numbered scores aren't really a good way to rate games to some degree. um, I would say something like Metal Gear Solid 3 is one of my favorite games of all time, but the controls are totally clunky, and you get used to them and it doesn't matter, but you're constantly wishing, I wish I could crouch walk, I wish I could do this or that, I wish there was a button to reload, stuff like that seems very obvious now, and you just don't have it. And yet, like Metal Gear Solid 5 has all of these things, but it's a totally different game. And I'm not saying one is better than the other. I think that's up to debate. Uh, I probably have spent more time overall playing Metal Gear Solid 5, and I think that it's been too recently for me to really say which one I enjoy more. But I definitely, Metal Gear Solid 3 is one of my favorite games of all time. And again, I can't think of many games that came out these last decade even that are completely flawless, which makes it seem like in some ways the games are getting worse. And I disagree, because I think there are a lot of games, way more variety in games these days than there ever has been before. I mean, it's easy to color code and it's easy to remember, especially back in the 90s and such, in the early 2000s, that, oh, there's all of this game and that game and this game. And we always forget all of the bad stuff, and our memories kind of lie to us in terms of how good things were. It's easy to look back on the PS2 generation and forget that lasted almost 10 years. And there was a lot of games that came out for the PS2 and a lot of genres because it lasted so long. And, even with the PS3 generation, it's clear that, stuff like shooters got a lot of the budget, but there's so many gems hidden on that system, from downloadable games to retail games. There's stuff like The Puppeteer, which I think is, again, one of my favorite games of all time. But nobody, most of the time, people haven't even heard of it, and it's kind of, people will always make that argument that games are getting worse and blah 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 blah. But I think in the long run, I think that it's a thing of nostalgia, of kind of, games are not how you remember them to some degree. But at the same time, I think games are getting bigger, more complicated, and overall better. There's so many games, I made a list of games that I want to buy this year coming out, and it's like 40 games. If you think back to even like the PS2 era, you would end up having lists of maybe 3 or 4 games a year that came out that were like, yes, I must have this. And it's such an interesting thing with it. It's now so many more games. And, when I look at the list of games that I wanted, they're all just different genres. You have RPGs, racing, you've got fighting games, there's collections of old games, which some people can get angry at remasters, but sometimes it's great when there's a kind of a collection of old games if you haven't played them and they do things to fix the old games, as it were. I was really pleased with the Jak and Daxter collection adding the ability to uninvert the camera horizontally, which was something that I always would get used to but hated about the original games, despite loving that series. So it was a great way to replay the games when I felt like replaying them, and I don't go back to my PS2 versions despite having so many old saves for them, because A, it looks better in HD, and B, they did little fixes like that, so it's a really great thing like that. But other genres, we have time attack style games. I've got first person shooters with split screen. I've got third-person action games. I've got stealth, um, kind of first-person walking adventures, point and click, platform 3D platformers, flying games, um, et cetera, et cetera. Just lots of different things. And there's games that are hard to classify, like No Man's Sky, um, like the Tomorrow Children and stuff like that, which kind of fit into multiple genres. And it's pretty fantastic in the long run. There's so many games coming out, so different. And tying back into my what is a perfect 10, I I don't think there's an answer for it anymore. I don't think that there's an answer consistent with what you would consider a perfect 10 back then. So my thing is my reason for if I was to rate games 10 these days, because people always ask me what I think the best games are, is every game that would be a 10 now has some flaws, and you can still enjoy them the same amount, if not more, than the games you would have given 10 in the Super Nintendo era. So something to just kind of be aware of. And again, lots of fantastic games. So everybody wins. So what games am I playing right now? Gravity Rush for the PS4. I love that game so much on Vita. I don't really, I'm not a trophy hunter or achievement hunter. It's not something I really care that much about. If I enjoy the game, I'll, like with Metal Gear Solid 5, I've spent 180 hours getting all the trophies. But the reason that I did it was not because I wanted trophies, but because I enjoyed the gameplay so much. When I finished the game, I was like, there's got to be more to do. I want to do more stuff. And, I mean, to be clear, this was 120 hours in, I think, when I hit this, and I just wanted to play the game more and more and more. So I said, well, fuck, I'll just get the trophies, and that'll be something to do. And, gave me another 60 hours to game, and I really enjoyed it all the way through. Even with some of the tedious and monotonous trophies, just having more gameplay in that world was a lot of fun. So, with that said, on the Vita version of Gravity Rush, I went through and got all of the trophies, as well as all the trophies for the downloadable content, and I just thoroughly enjoyed it all. It just was such a fun trip, and it has been a long time since I played it. The game came out in 2012, I think, so it's been a number of years, and I was looking forward to it coming out on the PS4, so I pre-ordered it on Amazon, since I think they're the only people that have the physical version in the United States, so I got that, and I expected to start playing it, and this is generally what happens with remasters when I get them. I start playing it, and I go, this is awesome. Let me wait till I'm in the right mood, and then I'll start playing it. So I kind of got into that thing, thinking that was what would happen with Gravity Rush, but I ended up just falling right back in love with it, and I've been going through the game over the last week or so since it came out. I think it's a little over a week now. Anyway, I've gotten every trophy as I've been going through the game. I've been doing all the trials and everything, because it's just so fun. I just love it. Every moment I'm playing that game, I'm just happy. There's, it's not without flaws. There's some issues with some of the combat can sometimes be a little janky when you're on foot and stuff. But it's fun to move around in, which is something that only a few games really get, I think. I would say like Spider-Man 2's web slinging on the PS2. That was just fun to go around the city. That's why most people remember the game. It's not for the combat or the story or anything, but it was so fun to move in that game. The same thing is true with Mirror's Edge, and I think that this falls in that same category. It's a game that's fun to move around in. And for whatever jankiness there can be in some of the other categories of the game, it's overall just a fun game, and it makes me smile constantly. So that's what I think of Gravity Rush. It's a fantastic port, a port that feels like the PS4 version is actually the main platform, and the Vita version was a port of it. So props to Blue Point Games, who are one of the best porting houses in the world, and they did the port. So great job. Let me see here. I'm playing through Zelda Skyward Sword finally. Me and my girlfriend have been playing through all the 3D Zelda games, starting with Ocarina of Time, then Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and now Skyward Sword. So we're finally up to the latest one, so we are ready for the new one when it comes out. And I am playing through it right now. And I played through Twilight Princess on the GameCube because I'm not a huge fan of motion controls. They kind of really make games less pleasant for me. On the flip side, I also like having when I'm playing a 3D game, like give me camera control. I'm constantly adjusting the camera. It's just kind of what I do. So there is that. I kind of was anxious going into Skyward Sword, while I was playing Twilight Princess. Like, oh no, I'm gonna have to go from this into losing my camera control and suddenly doing motion control. So jumping in, it took me, it took me a bit to get the handle on the controls. The camera doesn't bother me as much as I thought it would. It's okay. Every once in a while, it's a little awkward, but for the most part, it does not having camera control pretty well. So I have to give it props for that, because generally, if I don't have camera control in a 3D game, it just makes me angry and not want to play the game. So I give them props for that. The enemies are really the art style. I have love it and hate it moments. It feels somewhere between Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, where it's got more realistic characters towards, more artsy, realistic characters towards Twilight Princess, and at the same time, it's very colorful and kind of a whimsical art style to some degree with the enemies. So uh, it looks solid, but it also a little bland. It feels like they took. I mean, they're going for a watercolor look, which is, I think it's a really original thing to do, and I give them props for that. I personally don't like the watercolor look, so I can't say that it's a bad thing, but it's something that didn't click with me. It's one of the things they did was they basically took the color black out of the game and really just have kind of gradients of whatever color it is. So like where something would be, like if there's a brown thing with a shadow on it, the shadow is just really dark brown rather than black. And so without that contrast of black on things, it gives this kind of muted color palette in a way, and not in the kind of not the way you think of with like Gears of War or something, but it makes colors feel very dominating in scenes, because it's just they cover so much more of the scene. Where if you have something that's got two colors and a shadow on it, it looks like three colors. Now it's just two colors, and so it kind of it makes everything feel a little washed out in a way. It's hard to explain without looking at it yourself. So, again, this is my personal opinion. A lot of people love the art style, so whoever's listening to might enjoy it as well. Uh, I like some of the additions. They added a stamina gauge, so when you're walking around, rather than rolling everywhere, you can sprint. But the problem is that it has a gauge, so after it runs out, if you let it go all the way down, you have to walk for a little bit as it recharges, or you just have to keep waiting for it to go down all the way. And while you can roll, now it takes stamina, so you can't just roll everywhere. So it kind of, rather than fixing the problem, kind of puts a band-aid on it, because you're now, instead of just consistently rolling everywhere, now you run, stop, run, walk, run, walk, run, walk, run, walk until you get to where you're going, which feels like they should have just added an infinite run when you're just trying to get somewhere. It's fine for when you're running away from something or such, where it makes it feel a little bit more balanced, but if you're just trying to walk to somewhere in town, it gets really tedious. But on the flip side, I like some of the things they did with it. If you're running, you'll automatically jump off a ledge, where otherwise it's a little bit harder, which is really nice for some areas where you're platforming. If you run while running against a wall, you'll run and jump up the wall, which is, I think, a really original way to get up higher things, and it feels right, and I give them props for that. The story is also, I really dig it. It's starting to really be obvious that I feel like the Zelda series should have some form of voice acting. I feel like they should go the route of Shadow of the Colossus, where they speak in a made-up language, and I think that Zelda is already ripe for that, as they write in Hylian, which is their made-up language for the game. So if they just have them talk in this made-up Hylian language, it would work fine, I think, and it wouldn't. You could get away with still using Japanese voice actors if you want, and I think that it wouldn't sound as cheesy or dumb, because it's so strange nowadays. Now in Skyward Sword, to see these dramatic cutscenes that wait as text boxes pop up while somebody's talking and their mouth is moving and you're not hearing anything, or you're hearing like a and it takes me out of it, and it just makes me go, I wish they were just talking, even if it was a made up language that I can't understand. It would give it so much more drama to it. And I personally think that it would also benefit from Link talking, if only a little bit. Again, it feels weird where they're like, you're saving the world. We're not going to ever ask you anything. He's just going to show up, save the world, and leave. And it made a lot of sense where Zelda came from, like in the NES era, and even the Super Nintendo. where it made a little bit of sense to kind of have your protagonist silent and not, because back then storytelling was so much more simple. But I think now it's a little awkward again with the no voice acting plus the main character doesn't talk. It gets in the way of having a good narrative, and I think that it limits what you can do in the game in terms of a storyline. Uh, Suffice to say that the overall story so far and characters have been a lot more interesting than the last few games. I felt that Wind Waker had a beautiful art style, but only had about 3 or 4 characters that you found out more than 1 or 2 things about. Twilight Princess had a whole lot of characters, and they didn't develop any of them very well. So besides, just 2 or 3 characters in the game, most of them were basically cardboard cutouts. Um, then we've got this game, which feels like the characters have a lot more character to them, and I give them credit for that because I think that it's definitely a step up. So the motion controls. Let me get into that real quick. Even with the Wii Motion Plus, which is required to play the game, the motion controls are not perfect, and the game, at least in combat, often requires you to be very specific with things. So like Deku Babas, the flowers that attack you, you can only slash them in one way, so they'll open their like mouth things either vertically or horizontally, and you have to slice them in that way. And when it's not accurate, you swing at the Wiimote directly vertical, and he hits at like an angle, and it doesn't take effect. So oftentimes with boss fights and stuff, I will be doing something exactly how the game wants me to do it, and it won't read it that way, and I will get hit or knocked down, and it's incredibly frustrating. And it's not to do with the game specifically, but just that the hardware just doesn't work for that for me, and it really gets in the way of me enjoying the game, and it's a shame. And I would love a version of the game that you could play, even if it was kind of pared down, but if you could play it with just a standard controller, because I think I would enjoy the game a whole lot more. And that's so far my take on the motion controls, is that it gets in the way of just enjoying the game. So overall, I'm looking forward to finishing the game. It's not going to be something I'll put down. I'm enjoying it, but there's a lot of issues that I do have with it. The last game that I just finished actually last night was Vanquish, which is Platinum Games and Sega, and it was for PS3 and 360. It is a third-person shooter that is like octane-packed, as it were. Basically, Shinji Mikami, who is the creator of Resident Evil, directed it, and he, I guess, wanted to do kind of, I guess playing stuff like Gears of War, it felt very slow to him, so he wanted to be like, well, you spend so much time in cover and then running between cover and stuff. He wanted to do something much more fast-paced. And fast-paced it is. You basically play as somebody who's got a power suit on that has rocket boosters on its legs, so at any point you can start sliding on the ground at a very high speed to get between cover and cover, and you get crazy weapons, and it's basically over the top the whole game. And it's got this awesome almost 90s feel to it in some ways, of how just crazy over the top it is. It's got lots of fun guns and a great upgrade system and such. And the gameplay feels original and fun to play. And I enjoyed my time with it, but I definitely had issues with it overall. I felt like the game mechanics didn't change all that much throughout the game, and it started to get a little boring by the end because there's only a certain number of guns, and you can only upgrade, you only get a limited number of upgrades throughout the game, so it tends to make you want to hold on to specific guns that you upgraded, which when you have a small selection of guns anyway, feels like it makes it worth only sticking to a smaller selection, which is it makes it get boring quicker. That, and there isn't all that much that changes. At the beginning of the game, you're running between cover and stuff. End of the game, you're running between cover and such. There's not too many. You don't get new powers or anything. It's just same thing. And it's strange because overall it felt like a pretty short game. I'm guessing it took me 6 or 7 hours to finish it on normal. And there's not. I probably could have taken a little bit longer, but the whole game feels like you're just going in fast forward. And so even with a game that was kind of short, it's strange for it to feel a little repetitive by the end, which is not a great thing. But again, it was fun to play moment to moment. I just kept wanting more to it by the end, I would guess. It'd be my way of explaining what I felt like. In addition, the the art design was incredibly bland. It basically lots of shades of gray. You see gray, 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 gray. Walking around a space station and everything is gray constantly. Um, you go underground and it's a little brown and gray. So that, and it doesn't really look all that unique. It's very just sci-fi, futuristic kind of a thing. It feels like it could be a lot of different games a lot of the time in terms of just graphically, like the art style. Also, the characters in the story are pretty terrible most of the way through. It feels like everybody are like walking cliches or just uninteresting. And then right at the end, you're given some plot details that are kind of interesting, but by the time you get there, the game's just about to end. And so most of the game, the objective is we need to get there, and it doesn't give you a lot of motivation to keep pushing through it. It just feels like busy work to some degree. You're just like, I just kind of want to find out what's happening, and I don't care simultaneously because I haven't been given a reason to care about anything that's going on. So it was fun to play. I don't know if I could ever see myself going back, despite having a lot of options for replayability. There's time trials, there's harder difficulties, more things to unlock. And, you know, I give them credit. It's got a lot of stuff to do afterwards, but it is a short game, and I enjoyed my time with it, but again, I don't know if I'll ever go back. So I could recommend it. Definitely something to try. There's a demo of it, I believe, and if you enjoy the demo, just imagine 7 more hours of that. So, yeah, I give them major props for being creative with it. I just I was not without issues. So, let me see here. I thought I'd talk about a game that I've been thinking about recently. I was trying to think of games that either had the spotlight briefly or people didn't play or just didn't talk about. And so the one that came to mind for this episode was Tokyo Jungle, which is a downloadable game on PS3. And it's a very interesting game. I mean, it was first shown and it had, I think in the trailer, they had a part of the trailer where there's an elephant with roller skates on. But, that was the point where I was like, okay, no matter what, I'm buying this game. I just got to see what the heck it is. But it is a survival game where you play as animals after the apocalypse, and there's no humans left, and you're running around at like destroyed Tokyo. And it's not quite top down. It's kind of locked side view, and so you run around. It's not like 2D, but you run around. You have to keep yourself fed. You have to do these short missions where you have to intake a certain number of calories, or kill this many monsters, or find this specific monster, or occasionally fight bosses and stuff, and continue to survive for as long as you can. As your animal ages, it starts to get less and less stamina as it gets older, so you have to mate at some point and pass your genes on. And there's a lot of neat things to it, and it feels like a survival / arcade game. It really has that kind of, the stakes get higher and higher, and eventually you die and it starts over. And it has a campaign mode, but nobody cares. The campaign is okay, and it's very kind of obtuse to unlock it. You have to find discs in the survival mode, and then it unlocks one mission, and then you got to go back and play survival mode again and find different discs, etc., etc. But the survival mode is so dang good, and it has a great local co-op mode, which is just a lot of fun to play. And it's a silly, a little dark, and a lot of fun just to mess around with. And you can get it on the PlayStation Network for PS3. I believe it's got remote play for the PSP and the Vita. You can also get it on Best of the PlayStation Network Volume 1, which is a disc for the PS3, which also contains Oh No More Vikings, I think Sound Shapes, and maybe one other game. It's been a long time. So, totally worth checking out. It's a lot of fun, and it's not like anything else. So if you're in the mood for something original, check it out. So this is the end of the pilot episode of my podcast. So if you are interested, let me know. If you've got feedback, let me know. I would love to hear it. Would you like to hear more episodes? That I would also like to know. So just give me anything that you're willing to share, and have a wonderful day.